Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. The early 20th century English writer Gilbert Keith Chesterton inspired a generation with his beautiful prose and analysis of philosophical and religious debates of the time. A Catholic convert, he was anti both socialism and capitalism, and he wrote 80 books, hundreds of poems and short stories, and thousands of essays in his very short 62 years. Joining me today to discuss G.K. Chesterton is Karl Schmude, the president of the Australian Chesterton Society. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Karl.
Thank you, Georgina. It's very great to be with you.
And thank you for joining me all the way from Armidale in New South Wales, not Armidale in Melbourne. The spelling is, of course, different, but Armidale in New South Wales, which I have yet to visit and must do so one day. But tell me about the Australian Chesterton Society for a start. What is it? What do you do? And how long has it been going?
Yes, well, it was established in the early 1990s by an Englishman who had migrated to Perth, Tony Evans, and it was then the Chesterton Society of Western Australia. And by the year 2000, since it was very obvious there was a national interest in Chesterton, not just a state-based one, it became the Australian Chesterton Society. And Tony was the inaugural president of both, the state one and the National Australian Chesterton Society. And then I succeeded him about 15 years ago. So I've been serving in that role. Essentially, our role is to promote an interest in Chesterton. We hold an annual conference on different themes that tend to have a Chesterton connection. Since he wrote on everything, there's no subject that's irrelevant. So it's very easy to pick themes to focus the Chesterton conference on. We also publish an 8-page newsletter cum journal called The Defendant every quarter, and we distribute that to around about 200 people in Australia as well as quite a few overseas, because Chesterton has been remarkably popular throughout the world, and he's probably much more popular in the colonies, we might say, places like the United States and Australia especially, than he is in England, where he tends to have been fairly neglected, I think, since his death. But there's a flourishing American Chesterton Society, and the one in Australia continues to, I think, thrive. People continue to join it, and when they find out about it, there's all sorts of closet Chestertonians I've found throughout the country. So
Karl,
it's quite active.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fantastic. And to think that the Chesterton Society in Australia, at least, was only established 60 years basically after the death of Chesterton. So this was a long time coming. It somewhat reminds me of the Robert Menzies Institute that's been established over 40 years after the death of Robert Menzies here at the University of Melbourne, but never too late to start these things. Tell me, why should we care about G.K. Chesterton, a writer, from almost 100 years ago? He died in 1936.
Yes, it is, and it really relates to your question about the Chesterton Society. Why would you have a society in different places that is devoted to promoting his work? I think he is an author who has certainly transcended his time, and so many of the things he wrote about are of perennial interest and therefore are not confined to the first half of the 20th century when he was writing. There's so many occasions, we'll probably touch on some of the themes that show how remarkably valid his insights and his prophecies, actually. I think he did have a way of reading the signs of the times and detecting trends at an early stage of development, long before they became obvious to most of us. His Father Brown stories, of course, he was the creator of that Priest Detective. They continue to be read, and, of course, the TV series, not terribly faithful to Chesterton and the character, I think, for many people, but nonetheless very popular.
And at the time, of course, Karl, the Father Brown series were pretty much on par with Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot in terms of these murder mystery series of books that we know have been turned into
very
films
true.
or television series. It was quite the moneymaker
Yes.
for Chesterton, wasn't it, the Father Brown series?
It was, yes. When he was strapped for money, he would quite often just run off a Father Brown story. And when some of the people you mentioned, Agatha Christie, for example, and Dorothy Sayers, when they established what was called a detection club, which was essentially writers of detective fiction in Britain, Chesterton was asked to be the first president. So I think his priest detective character has proved remarkably enduring. He also wrote literary criticism. His books on Dickens, for example, are still regarded by scholars as well as ordinary readers as showing great insight into the works of Dickens. And his educational philosophy, his social and political philosophy, there's all sorts of echoes that you find these days in various places that indicate the continuing impact his writings and his thought have been having.
He had great friendships across the spectrum, ideological spectrum and religious spectrum, which was interesting. I enjoyed reading about a description of him, a physical description of him, that he was incredibly tall, especially for the era. He was, I think, 6'4", and he weighed about 150 kilos or so. So he was a big gentleman. A larger gentleman.
Very.
And it was funny,
Yes.
There's a fantastic anecdote between him and his good friend George Bernard Shaw, which I'm sure you'll be familiar
Yes.
with, Karl, where Chesterton, and they disagreed on many things, but were very fond of each other. And George
Yes.
Bernard Shaw, we should give the context here, was an extremely thin person. So Chesterton met him one day and said, "To look at you, anyone would think famine has struck England." And George Bernard Shaw, in true form, has quipped back, "To look at you, anyone would think you had caused it." I love that. I love that exchange.
Yes,
Why can't we have those types of
he
exchanges
was
these days?
That's right. No, just a huge presence. And I have, in various talks over the years, mentioned Chesterton's size. And while some might regard that as a worry these days, he constantly made jokes himself about them and recalled things. I mean, for example, when he was in the United States, he lectured at the University of Notre Dame for a period on Victorian literature. And he had a person who picked him up at the hotel each morning, and he always had great difficulty getting into a car and even greater difficulty getting out of it. And one lady trying to help him said, "Should we move you out sideways?" And he said, "Madam, I have no sideways." So wasn't an easy matter.
Now, before we get on to Chesterton's views on all sorts of things and whether he was a conservative or not, those types of debates, it's probably worth talking about why are we talking about Chesterton on the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute Afternoon Light? And it is, of course, because Robert Menzies was a massive fan of Chesterton, and I think typical of the age. Menzies was born in 1894. He would have grown up reading a lot of Chesterton, and in fact in his collection here at the University of Melbourne we can see he owned 8 Chesterton books that it looks like he has acquired in the 1910s, because he's written his own name in the front cover. One is given to him, but he has used these books. You can see there's a lot of underlining, there are annotations, and he's used these books also in his major addresses subsequently after his, I guess, teenage years and 20s when he was enjoying them. He's using them when it comes to his views on education. He uses All Things Considered when he's criticising how journalists just seem to condense a speech and summarise it and don't actually get the intended message, and obviously criticising journalists for being way too brief in their analysis. It was a concern Chesterton had eloquently displayed in that book. So it's interesting how someone like Menzies, he's enjoying Chesterton's work, but he's also heavily influenced when it comes to his views on education, his views on property rights, his views on the damage sectional interests in politics can have, his mistrust of materialism and utilitarianism, and his real focus on the family as a building block of society and the importance of family to the success of society. So all these things really were shaping Robert Menzies' ideas and views on how he thought Australia should work and the world should work. So that is why we are here today talking about Chesterton, not least because he is an important figure anyway.
No, the affinities that Robert Menzies had with Chesterton's ideas, yes, have impressed me, Georgina. I learnt quite a lot more about Robert Menzies and just been thinking of the affinities that they had. One, I think, that does come out very powerfully in Menzies' writings and speeches and attitudes is that they both had, Chesterton and Menzies had a great regard, very unpatronising regard for ordinary people, for the ordinary person, the man and woman in the street. And Chesterton articulated that in so many ways. He loved ordinary people. And if you then move to Menzies' ideas, you think of the great celebrated speech, The Forgotten People. There's echoes there, I found, with Chesterton's great poem of 1907 called The Secret People, where he says, smile at us, pay us, pass us, but do not forget we are the people of England who have not spoken yet. So even the word forget is in that line that Menzies captured so well in that 1942 speech. But I think it does pervade his own ideas, and I'm sure the resonance that he felt when he would read Chesterton's essays or his writings on particular issues, he responded to those very positively, as for so many people, Chesterton articulated what they deeply felt and thought, but may not have had the opportunity or the words to be able to express that. And Chesterton did that remarkably well, I think.
He obviously was an incredible writer and his prose is beautiful. And as you said earlier, the essays he wrote on Victorian era literature, particularly Charles Dickens, are still highly valued to this day, and just for their kind of deliciousness in terms of their articulation, his erudition. I guess it would be useful to understand, we should eschew labels because they're not helpful. They put people into boxes that they might not necessarily fit into perfectly. But how would you describe Chesterton's philosophical approach? Was he an arch-conservative, as some have said? He was latterly converted to Catholicism, although he was a sort of high church Anglican to start with. So he had a religious basis to a lot of his views. But how would you characterise Chesterton in a neat, kind of efficient way?
Yes, very difficult, unfortunately. I think he is not at all easy to categorise and let alone confine. And in some ways, I think he was conservative, according to the way the categories are still applied, I suppose. He'd be regarded as a social conservative because of what you mentioned, Georgina, his belief in the family, the fundamental building blocks of society. While he didn't write, say, on home ownership, Menzies' great emphasis on home ownership would have resonated with Chesterton's belief in the importance of the family and the security and stability provided by owning one's own home. But then on the other side, I'd regard him as something of a radical, a political radical, in that he wasn't just disposed to keep things as they are. He wanted, as you mentioned, he opposed both capitalism and socialism. And the essence of that was that they both concentrated power and wealth in a few hands. Governments did it in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats, and capitalism did it in the hands of big corporations. And that's continued even to this day, I suppose, with the rise of big tech, just another form of quite concentrated power. Whereas Chesterton believed in what was called distributism, and that is that power should be distributed as widely as possible. That was the best safeguard of freedom, and also the way in which freedom could be personally fulfilling as well as socially and politically creative. So in that way, I don't think he was conservative at all. He was, if anything, I suppose if you had to put a label on him, he was a political radical and a social conservative.
It's interesting reading about Chesterton and reading some of his writings, how much obviously you can see Menzies is borrowing from him. Menzies broadcast in 1942 on Has Capitalism Failed? He talks about how we should impose upon capital the most stringent duty to discharge its social and industrial duty, and that we want a modern and civilized capitalism, and that Menzies, in sort of forming his political ideas that would end up leading to the Liberal Party, he talks about the individualist movement as not each to himself and the devil take the hindmost, but in the good sense, every man is his brother's keeper. So this sort of sense of duty, of a moderation of capitalism, of making sure that people are looked after and that there is no sort of overarching power, as you said, either the state from socialism or the big business corporations from capitalism, that's the individual at a very singular sense who have power over their own lives and over their own property, and that distributed sense of power gives the best outcome in society.
Yes, that's right. And I think he also saw that freedom and power exercised in that way inevitably fostered individual responsibility. So the two attitudes were in harmony, that freedom was seen as related to responsibility. And finally, if one were to talk in a spiritual sense, and Chesterton did very often, a sense of love, a sense of great loyalty and commitment to people, and particularly, he wrote books on marriage, for example. He had a very strong view of what he called the freedom of the vow, namely that freedom is exercised not in an unrestricted way, but something that was accepted, that was exercised within certain limits, that was self-imposed. It wasn't that they were imposed by the state. So it wasn't in that sense a legally binding contract so much in his mind. It was a promise made, a mutual making of a promise, of a vow. He says in one of his comments about freedom, he says, "I could never conceive or tolerate any utopia which did not leave to me the liberty for which I chiefly care, the liberty to bind myself." So typically paradoxical, where Chesterton, and he was often regarded as the prince of paradox, said things that at first seem contradictory. And then when you probe and penetrate the meaning that he's driving at, in a journalist way, he will say it pithily and sharply, but that's to arouse attention and provoke thought, I think. And so often something he expresses paradoxically, by turning it on its head, turns out to be a great insight, which we've lost an understanding of. So
it's interesting when you read Chesterton's views on freedom, that sense that you have a freedom to shackle yourself, to encumber yourself, to bind yourself, not a freedom from being shackled or from restrictions. No. He didn't think of freedom in those terms, did he? You had the choice, the freedom to do things that would limit your freedom. But the fact that you had the freedom to do that is freedom.
That's very, very true, yes. It was both a freedom from great encroachments of power exercised, particularly by political systems, but the freedom from was really a prelude to understanding a freedom too, as you said. That is, what is the freedom there for? In what way will it satisfy human beings if it's directed to a purpose and a goal? And keeping both those in mind, whereas in contemporary culture, we're very strong on freedom from, but not quite have in focus what the purpose of freedom is. And Chesterton, I think, wrote on that a great deal during his life.
Karl, the book The Man Who Knew Too Much that Chesterton published in 1922, I think would have really resonated with Robert Menzies. It's a novel that highlights corruption in English politics, and it discredits the political class in that interwar period. It's concerned with vested interests and the influence they have on politics. And this is something that Robert Menzies, in those 1920s, 1930s period, he was really very disappointed with in Australian politics, in Victorian politics, in the federal scene, that there were vested interests who were calling on favours from politicians, and politicians were acting on those vested interest requests, and he felt it was a corrupting influence. This book, an incredibly important book in really exposing what was quite obviously a big problem.
Yes, and Chesterton did write on that a great deal. There are some who think that he was overly absorbed by the political scene, and he was certainly a natural controversialist in that Christopher Hitchens way, as you mentioned at one stage. But he, given the books that he wrote, the books of philosophy, of history, his novels, his poems, his plays, people have commented over the years that he should have spent more time doing that. But I think this is where his genius showed no bounds. He was, as a journalist, and he always regarded himself as a journalist. He thought that was a noble profession. It was a journalist in the sense not so much of reporting, but interpreting events, getting them in perspective. And he was so incredibly prolific. A story, for example, he used to dictate his articles to a secretary, and then it would be typed up and he'd just send it off. On one occasion, a new secretary to whom he was dictating an article noticed that he was writing on a pad on his desk while he was dictating. When she went over at the end after he'd gone out, she noticed that he was writing another article on a different topic for a different newspaper from the one that he had been dictating to.
Wow.
That is prodigious energy that is almost beyond belief.
Yeah, the intellectual acrobatics required to be dictating and writing two different things.
Exactly, keeping. Yeah. No, most of us struggle with the single thought, as it were. But to your point, Georgina, I mean, he was the editor of a journal that was called GK's Weekly, and it was essentially a journal of social and political criticism. And that was a key avenue for the promulgation of his ideas. And certainly the political corruption and the degree to which I think he felt that big business and big politics, if you like, had a sort of an unholy alliance about them that was terribly detrimental to the lives of ordinary people. So he promoted it very much from that point of view, not just upbraiding certain leaders who were thought to be corrupt, but the popular effects of that and how seriously people were disadvantaged because of the extent to which that power was concentrated and corrupting.
Yeah, so Chesterton did join the Fabian Society very early on, didn't he? But he does write in his autobiography that imperialism and socialism, and obviously then capitalism, were things he really opposed, and he'd sort of grown up obviously in the imperial era, British Empire, and seen the problems of that. But in terms of socialism, he didn't like the influence of big business on big politics. He certainly didn't like the idea that socialism had this idea that, and he writes, an ordinary person is incompetent and must be superseded by an official. Can you talk about the basis for his opposition to socialism beyond the fact that individuals were seen as incompetent and they needed to be replaced by the state, by bureaucracy?
Yes. Well, I think he regarded socialism in relation to capitalism as the wrong solution. It was actually really rearranging the pieces on the chessboard where government concentrated the power instead of big corporations or big business.
So they were basically two sides of the same coin. So you had socialism was the state, big state, and capitalism was big business, but both of them meant that the individual was superseded, whether it was the state or a business, it didn't matter. They were both tyrannical.
Yes, that's right. And both of them, particularly if they ended up, as so often in practice, where they were in some kind of silent union of concentrated power interests, whereas he wanted power widely distributed. George Bernard Shaw, whom you mentioned, they were, yes, great friends, but disagreed on virtually everything. And they did debate because Shaw was a great socialist and Chesterton a distributist, and they often had public debates on those subjects. And while distributism has been seen as the widest possible distribution of property, the property really reflected the reality of power, that is, individual freedom and power that the ordinary person could have through owning property. And so when Shaw spoke about socialism and welfare, for example, and wanted to, in effect, distribute money or redistribute, Chesterton said what he was interested in was distributing power, not distributing money, but distributing power. And by providing for an environment in which monopolies are discouraged, home ownership is encouraged, property is as widely distributed as possible, including in terms of businesses. He certainly would have favoured family-based businesses as ways in which the family would have a certain degree of independence and security rather than be dependent in the way that somebody in the normal salary sense is. So those are attitudes that he promoted. And as you said, in all sorts of books, I mean, apart from the direct way he did it, he was also, without propagandising, I think, he was able to do it to such an extent because of the integration of his thought, I think. He was able to do it in fiction as well as in non-fiction.
What's interesting too, when you look at contrast between distributism and socialism, is the sense that with distributism, private property is so important. And through private property, that there is a real link with freedom, with liberty. So you own, the private property is distributed widely throughout society, throughout families, throughout individuals, rather than concentrated in the hands of just a few. And quite the opposite of socialism, where it is concentrated in the hands of the state.
That's correct, yes. I think it was a fundamental part of his social and political attitudes. And so while he didn't promote any particular movement, the philosophy that he had, which, as you've mentioned, is one that Menzies in different ways appreciated, he expressed again and again, as a journalist would, looking at particular events and developments, but always applying much higher standards of understanding and interpretation to those events so that he put them in perspective.
Karl, you say he had a regular newsletter that he put out commenting on politics and social affairs, but did he particularly align with a side of politics at all, or did he stay right out of the sort of partisan fray and just focus on his own views and ideas and let other people decide whether they fit into a partisan box, so to speak?
Yes, I don't think he at all identified particularly with any of the dominant parties. And as we were discussing earlier, I think about whether he was a conservative or not. In some ways, his attitudes would have been more compatible with a particular party's platform, but then in certain other ways, he would have had affinities with a different party. So I don't think he saw that as the environment in which the greatest understanding of societies and cultures and political activities can be understood, that we need to sort of transcend the party political platforms and try to have a consistent philosophy informing one's attitudes rather than simply taking them from a particular party platform.
And that, of course, gave him huge freedom to say exactly what he thought or write exactly what he thought, because he wasn't concerned about what the politician said, what party said. It was about what he believed.
Yes.
I wondered, Karl, if we could talk about his impact in Australia, particularly his ideas around distributism, which when you read it, you are very much reminded of B.A. Santamaria's thoughts about everyone should own a little farm around Australia. And even though B.A. Santamaria only ever lived in Melbourne, I think he thought the idyllic utopia was everyone living on a little farm and producing their own food and the like. But these Chesterton ideas, you can see them seeping into political actors in Australia, not just Menzies, but also Santa Maria and his DLP.
Yes, well, I think his influence, and it's continued in this way, has been both personal and corporate, one might say, communal. There are so many people that were influenced, I think, by his ideas. And you mentioned Santa Maria, very much influenced by his political and social ideas. But then also the group that Santa Maria was an early member of was the Campion Society, established in the early 1930s, particularly of recent graduates in the University of Melbourne and people who'd moved into the professions, a young group of people, and they were tremendously devoted to Chesterton, and they were a Catholic group, and therefore they focused on his books of philosophy such as Orthodoxy or The Everlasting Man, books that are still available and reprinted. But the Campion Society ran adult education courses through the different branches that spread throughout Victoria, into rural Victoria, and then throughout all of the states. So an interesting connection with the Australian Chesterton Society is that the Campion Society in Western Australia, when it was established, they actually called it the Chesterton Club.
Ah.
It was not called the Campion Society over there. It was called the Chesterton Club. So it makes it rather appropriate that later, when the Australian Chesterton Society was born, it began in Western Australia. So I think the Campion Society was a cradle for many, many thinkers and writers who were influenced by his thought in so many ways. And then if we move into more recent times, we'll find people such as Greg Sheridan, the well-known journalist, who's very much a fan of Chesterton's and has written about him and is, again, I think, thinking of him as a journalist, was very much involved in the same profession. Campion College invokes the same name as Campion Society of the 1930s. It was created in Sydney as a liberal arts college, opened in 2006, and I served as co-founder with Brisbane friend and businessman Mr. James Power Sr., and many others have come out in support of the college. It's attracted students from all over Australia, and while Chesterton is not actually set on the curriculum, his influence is certainly present there in the foundation of the college. I often referred to him as a one-man liberal arts program, since he wrote on in all of the subjects that we teach at Campion: history, philosophy and literature and language and so on. So I think those are corporate examples, if you like, community developments that reflect Chesterton's influence of his ideas. And similarly, at the personal level, there's people who continue to, and have over the years, remarkably, well over a century since he was writing to such a, so prolifically.
Absolutely. I thought we'd finish our conversation today, Karl, talking about Chesterton's views on education, which was something Robert Menzies was passionate about. And when you read Chesterton on education, you can see how much Menzies was influenced by his ideas. And of course,
yes,
he actually quotes him quite a bit in his major speeches and writings, particularly in the 1939 address that Menzies made on the place of a university in a modern community. And Menzies is saying a university has to be a place where citizens are imbued with knowledge for the sake of knowledge, so that they can be critical thinkers and independent thinkers, independent of their boss, independent of the state when they're confronted by issues. And I mean, Chesterton writes of rights and wrongs, of slavery, of cannibalism, and these sort of types of extreme issues, that
yes,
having a university education equips you to critique them and disagree with them and understand why they are wrong, rather than just go through some vocational training that equips you to do a job rather than to think. And Chesterton writes about how the whole object of education is to broaden the mind, to really learn a general view of the history of man, the nature of man, and for him, the nature of God, to consider what is right and what is wrong, that sort of idea of morality, that you are given standards and you can judge conditions in society. These are really important concepts and important foundational elements of why we have universities, why we have education more broadly, and have been so very much challenged in Australia. And Menzies, in a lot of ways, when it came to education, was an outlier, on his side of politics, yes, but even on the other side of politics, there haven't been very many leaders in Australia who have taken an overtly non-utilitarian view of education.
Yes, that is quite remarkable, I think, Georgina. Yes, I think Chesterton's understanding of education was an exalted one. He was much more than skill training or job preparation. It was something that involved, as he called it on one occasion, the truth in a state of transmission. So it was about the transmission of learning, of cultural memory, and finally of truth that gave meaning to social and political experience, and therefore provided the basis of citizenship, the cultivation of leadership, those sort of qualities that came out of belief in education that transcended the utilitarian idea, that it's simply to prepare you for one single thing, one particular career path, for example. It was a much deeper and richer experience students needed to be exposed to. And I think Chesterton saw the importance of a coherent philosophy informing the learning, and that insofar as that was the case, it provided for the health and continuity of a culture. By contrast, an incoherent philosophy would rupture a society and make it dysfunctional. And I think Chesterton saw that was happening in education in his time, and therefore in society at large. The wider ramifications of that intellectual dysfunction, intellectual incoherence, would spread to the lives of people. So, yes, I think a view of education, and specifically of university education, even though he wasn't a person who went to university himself.
No, he went to art school, didn't he?
He did, yes. He was really an artist before he became a writer, and he went to what was called the Slade School of Art in London. So some of his friends from school would have gone off to university, but he was not a university person.
Maybe that's why he liked them so much, do you think, Karl?
Yes, yes.
Well, direct experience.
You do wonder, don't you? But, I mean, another statement he made, just again to show how exalted an understanding he had, he said that education was simply the soul of a society, as it passes from one generation to another. So that's really raising the stakes, I think, as to what a noble undertaking it is and how important it is for a society to get that right if it's going to survive.
Karl, Schmude, thank you so much for this discussion on Chesterton. I feel like I have 80 books to get through and thousands of essays and poems and short stories to get through to really imbibe all that is G.K. Chesterton. What an incredible story and enduring legacy he has. And, of course, you have your upcoming Chesterton conference, don't you, at the end of October? So would you like to give that a quick spruik?
We do. Thank you, Georgina. Yes, October 21, Saturday, October 21 at Campion College in Sydney. Greg Sheridan will be one of our speakers at that, and the theme is Chesterton and the Rise of a Counterculture. So it's looking at various developments in journalism, publishing, the media, education, politics, business that reflect Chesterton's ideas and starting to move towards something of a countercultural development, not in a negative sense, because it's still in favour of culture. It's counter a dominant culture, but as Chesterton believed so much positively, it's about building an alternative. That is what the focus of the conference will be. So,
fantastic.
Information's available on the website, the Australian Chesterton website, Georgina.
And we'll make sure we put that in our show notes for this. Thank you so much, Karl, for joining me on Afternoon Light today. It's been a great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.